All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about the actual process of Confederation. We sort of mentioned that it happened a little while ago, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. There's a little bit more to that story. So we're going to talk a little bit about what prompts that. And one of the things that we should understand is that there are some internal drivers of Confederation, i.e. things that are happening within what is now called Canada, and some external stuff, things that are happening outside of Canada that are also driving that. So the first of those, in terms of external drivers, because those are generally simpler to get through, and things that we're not dealing with in the same sort of way now, but in 18th, so there's a couple of pieces of like US history you need to understand that sort of push us towards Confederation in Canada. So we have sort of talked about Confederation existing in 1867. The Charlottetown Conference is in 1864, but we'll sort of talk about that next time around, next video. But it's really important to understand that there's something happening in the United States at in this same time period. And we talked a little bit about the concerns about what happens when you have a large standing army that has nothing to do, especially when you have no way of treating or addressing something like PTSD. So it's important to understand that when I say the US Civil War ends in 1865, so this is the war between the northern and southern states, this means that there is not one but two armies that remain on the continent who need something to do. And there's sort of a way of sort of looking at that from like an economic and social perspective. And then in a lot of ways, it's actually easier to keep those soldiers essentially fighting wars than it is to sort of reintegrate them back into society. So there's that sort of like concern. And also, it's important to recognize that already by 1865, the United States has a reputation of being pretty expansionist. So they're looking to expand their territory, and it's not unfamiliar to most people who are living in Canada by this point in time that part of that desire to expand might reasonably be moving north into Canada. And that's, the War of 1812, that's all of those kinds of considerations. When we talk about drivers for Confederation inside the sort of the Canadian political entity, we are coming up with some different motivations for Confederation, and it's important to understand that in a lot of ways, those motivations for Confederation are different for different people within the country. So we'll get into sort of what people thought Confederation was a little later on in this unit, but for right now, understand that there are some of those motivators that are pretty common across all of Canada. So for example, we often talk about globalization like it's a new thing. It's really not. Globalization is a process that's been going on for a really long time. And when we talk about globalization in the 1860s, which is very much not the same as what we experience now, but you're talking about more integrated trade networks, you're talking about faster transportation, you're talking about a more interconnected society overall. And in that environment, it becomes much more difficult to sort of build a really, really strong economic position. So without connections and relationships sort of outside of a very small circle, you need that kind of alliance, you need that kind of trading relationship, you need all of those pieces. So there's sort of that kind of economic, like global pattern pushing people towards that. I mean, that's an internal drive for a strong economy, but an external sort of factor about globalization. And then there's some stuff that is really sort of specific to inside the country. So one of the things that's happening is this is the first time that we're sort of seeing economies decline in the Maritimes. So they're sort of like, maybe this is something that we should talk about. Maybe that we sort of have that sort of feel. There's the very age-old tension that the Anglophones in Upper Canada are not super happy with having to share a political organization with the Francophones of Lower Canada. Francophones aren't happy by the way that they're getting treated, and they're looking for sort of some more fairer representation in this kind of space. There's a recognition, again, internally and sort of within the colonies that sort of occupy what is now Canada, that if each colony individually is relating to indigenous groups, things can get really complicated really, really quickly, because settlers don't necessarily respect those boundaries, and those boundaries in a lot of ways are also arbitrary for indigenous groups. So there's sort of some pushes in that kind of way. Some students already mentioned it in our last sort of unit, but the gold rush is happening in British Columbia, and so there's sort of some conversation about what that might look like, and it's changing immigration patterns. So there's a lot of different things to sort of understand about that. And it's also important to understand that when we talk about Confederation, we're actually talking about, like, at least in 1867, we're actually talking about like a really small portion of what is now Canada. Um, this is another unit where I will put up a PowerPoint with some maps, so you can go take a look about Canada in sort of 1867 and what is actually included in this new Confederation of Canada. And it's actually a really small portion of the Maritimes and sort of like eastern and southern Quebec and Ontario. It's not a very big piece of land. The remainder is the Northwest Territories, which eventually get carved up into a number of territories and that sort of space, and Rupert's Land, which is owned by the Hudson's Bay Company. So we've had some conversations about why is this fur trading company administering government across the country, but that's okay. That's sort of what they're doing right now. And British Columbia's borders are largely intact at this point, but they exist as a separate colony and they don't join Confederation in 1867. So we're talking about the sort of economic and social concerns of a relatively small portion of what is now Canada. Which is not to say that there are not Europeans living in other parts of Canada. It's just that they're not included in these initial sort of conversations around Confederation. They're not involved in the discussions that lead to things that we've already talked about, like, the weird division of powers and how that sort of creates some challenges and some overlaps in that sort of space. So that's sort of like a very brief introduction to what's going on there. We will talk a little bit about the Charlottetown Conference and sort of what's happening in that space, in those events. We'll talk about that in our next video. We'll get into sort of how we convince people to actually show up and do this thing and all of those sorts of pieces and sort of what comes out of that. But other than that, we'll sort of move through this idea about Confederation right now.